we'll get it.
There's going to be an announcement soon.
Yeah.
Not that,
I'm going to start, Sally. Sally, I'm going to start. I got to start. Yeah.
Okay. Let me know. Just Sally. Just Sally.
It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. It's fine. Hear me? Can everybody hear me? I guess they can because they're stopping to talk. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Goldberg from The Atlantic magazine, and I'm very happy to see so many of you come on this bright, sunny day in the world's most beautiful place to the panel discussion of how the world is going to end. The level of masochism at the Aspen Ideas Festival sometimes astonishes me. The general theme of this festival is sort of looking at the 10th anniversary to look 10 years ahead. And we're going to do that in the context of this question of what is the world's most dangerous problem or place. The idea came out of a conversation I was having with Kitty Boone not long ago. And we were talking about all of these Middle East issues, and I said, I'm not an Asia person, but I said the South China Sea issue seems pretty dangerous, the Korean Peninsula seems pretty dangerous, and sometimes we scant those in these conversations. So I'm hoping we can sort of take a tour around the world of some horrible things, and then go get snacks. Free snacks. How bad could the world be? But I have an all-star panel assembled. I always hate when people say our panel needs no introduction and then they introduce them. So I'm not going to say it. You have long bios of everyone, but very short. You have Jim Steinberg, who is the dean of, I always call it the Maxwell House School, but it's actually the Maxwell School at Syracuse. Former Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, who is the president of Brookings, also a former Deputy Secretary of State, among other things. Jane Harman, you all know, of course, in that she's the one in the red. Just in case there was confusion up here. Right. 9 terms in Congress, intelligence expert, foreign policy expert, president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Michael Oren, very well-known historian, recently former Israeli ambassador to the United States. And so what I want to do, and I want each of you to take a minute or two for this first question, and we'll start with Jim. And that's simply to answer the question. If the president comes to you, a new president comes to you, doesn't know anything, and says, what is the thing I have to worry about the most on the international scene? What is the problem that can go from 0 to potentially apocalyptic catastrophe in a short period of time? Where would you take us? And take a minute or two, and then I'll ask each of you to sort of weigh in on that question.
So the one thing about these kinds of predictions or trying to figure out where the bad things are going to happen is we almost never get them right, and it's the place that we didn't think of. So what's
the place that we're not thinking of?
So it's tempted to sort of say, well, actually, it's going to be Tierra del Fuego, and that and the truth is that I teach this and I tell my students, what's the greatest catastrophe you can imagine? They come up with all kinds of great things. And it turns out an asteroid hitting the Earth is a much better answer to this than almost any of the things we're likely to come up with, extinction of the species and all that. But I'm going to pick the South and East China Sea. And part of the reason I pick it is because we're all very preoccupied right now with the 100th anniversary of World War I. But just as I think at the time, as we got up to 1914, that few people would have guessed that the assassination of an heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo would lead to the war to end all wars. So I think there's a risk here in the conflicts over the maritime space and the islands in the South and East China Sea, that what seems like a kind of a second-order issue because of the stakes involved and the broader relations involved in East Asia now could potentially be the kind of spark that would lead to really dramatic changes in the international environment. We all know that one of the most dangerous times in international relations is when there are changes in power relations, and we're seeing that in East Asia today. Obviously, the dramatic rise of China, a very transformational experience as the economic power of China is now being unleashed both to greater military power, but also very strong nationalism within China. But at the same time, Japan, which is determined not to be marginalized in the region, and a country that is trying to regain its role and its influence. And the history of the two countries, very, very tense, very difficult stories that really motivate their publics to fear each other and to see dangers. And so we see in this conflict, particularly over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, the potential for two countries who are fighting over a very insignificant piece of land, rocks that have, famous for albatross feathers. Yet they each see this as a test of the future of their relations, about who's going to dominate the region, who's going to be the top dog, who's going to really run the order.
So if it weren't these islands, it would be something else?
It would be something else, because each of them see this as a proxy of a broader set of issues and conflicts about who's going to be the dominant power in the region. And the United States has a huge stake in this. We obviously have a huge economic stake in East Asia, but we have a special stake because of our treaty relationship with Japan. And because we have this treaty relationship with Japan, we have a set of obligations to be supportive of the Japanese and to resist the idea that China can use its new muscle to try to push its way around, to force the Japanese to accept their version of what the right answer is to these islands. So what the risk is here is that the Chinese will see this as a test of their own sovereignty, a test of their new power. The Japanese will see that any compromise here is runs the risk that it's the slippery slope, that if they give in here, the next thing you know, it'll be the Ryukyu Islands, it'll be Okinawa, and then pretty soon it'll be another world in which China dominates. And so each sees their test of credibility, a small issue being raised to assess a basic principle. And because we have a treaty commitment here, the question is going to be, can the United States be relied on? If China pushes its way forward, if China tries to push the Japanese out of the Senkaku Islands, are we going to stand up to it? Even though our personal stakes, our national stakes seem very small, our credibility is at issue. And we've seen in American history when credibility becomes an issue, think Vietnam, how we can get drawn into a conflict. And so for both China and the United States, the disputes that are emerging in this region, most dramatically in East China Sea, but also in the South China Sea, we see this with China and the Philippines, China and Vietnam, are going to be tests about what's the new order, what's the power structure in the region.
So very quickly, how does that spin up
into
a war in which the United States gets involved?
Give you the scenario. So today, China and Japan are disputing who owns these islands, the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. We say that we don't take a position on who actually owns them, but we do believe, because we had control over those at the end of World War II and we gave them to Japan, that Japan has administrative control. And under our treaty, we are obliged to support Japan if that control is contested. China claims these islands, and they're angry with the way Japan has handled this issue. They've increasingly begun to patrol around the islands, in the air, around the sea. The Japanese are defending their sovereignty. The Chinese are asserting their sovereignty, either intentionally or even by accident. One could imagine a Chinese ship being attacked by a Japanese ship, a Chinese military aircraft being attacked by a Japanese aircraft, and the problem escalating, a small conflict escalating to a conflict between the two, and the Japanese turning to the United States and they say, where are you? This is where your treaty commitment is. What are you going to do to honor your commitment? And then the question is the United States prepared to potentially get even to a shooting war with China over what seems like such a small issue?
It could even be an accident, right?
It could even be an accident. And
a lot of these things can start as accidents.
Proximity.
Right? Yeah.
We've seen this. You'll remember it was just a decade ago that the United States and China came to a near conflict when one of our patrol planes, the EP-3, came into a collision with a Chinese fighter. That was negotiated out, but that was a different time. We weren't as worried about being a compromise, being willing to try to find a way to save face. Now there's much more pressure on both sides to stand up, to show that they're tough, to not give in. And that question of showing credibility, of showing toughness on both sides, fueled by nationalism all around, is a recipe for a disaster.
Strobe, you want to add on to that, or you want to introduce a completely?
No, I would like to introduce another one. I want to test the proposition that there actually is one rather bleak prediction that is almost surefire. And that is that 10 years from now, the answer to the question of what will be the most dangerous place on Earth is the entire planet.
Oh, you're such a buzzkill.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but I think I heard a murmur of assent and recognition of what I'm talking about, which is climate change. There is, alas, unless Jane can give us some basis for optimism, that there is no will whatsoever in Washington where it's really needed, which is in the area of legislation, to have the United States take leadership in doing something about climate change. So we're going to sit on our hands for another 10 years, even if there is marginal progress. And in those 10 years, we're going to be 10 years closer to a mid-century tipping point that the scientists see. And that portends multiple interactive catastrophes, ecological for sure, economic for sure, humanitarian for sure, geopolitical, which brings it into the realm that we're a little more comfortable with. What we remember as the polar ice cap, where Santa Claus used to live, will be the polar sea. And remember that a country who will probably come up in this conversation, Russia, has planted a titanium flag on the North Pole. And I just don't see any sign that we, by which I mean the entire human enterprise, are taking this seriously.
What aspect of dramatic climate change worries you the most? Mass movement of refugees, which would destabilize?
Keep going. My answer will be all of the above when you give me the multiple choice. And as I was saying, they're going to play into each other in very perverse ways.
Let me ask you this one thing, though. What do you think, what has to happen on Earth to trigger that emergency sense that you want to see triggered?
I would say two things, one of which is already happening and the other of which I don't understand why it isn't happening. The phenomenon is apparent to us now, not just in the statistics that are coming out on the warming of the planet, but also, you know, it isn't just global warming, it's also global weirding, extreme weather. And there's some indications in the polls that the public is grabbing hold of that. But I think the other than the legislative and policy fixes, which essentially involve, of course, discouraging the use of hydrocarbons by putting a price on carbon, is that we have to, as the responsible species on the planet, adopt an ethos in practical terms that recognizes our responsibility, which is unlike any previous cohort in humanity, the responsibility we have for our progeny. And if individuals can't both have that sense of responsibility, given their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids and generations to come, who will not have the opportunity to do anything about it if we pass that tipping point. So they have to do that. We all have to do that. And somehow then we have to translate that into political will on the part of our leaders.
Jane.
I'm too depressed to answer. Straub was right. What forces political change, let me just, and then I'll turn to a different topic, is catastrophe. I mean, I'm going to mention terrorism in a moment. But as the oceans surge and my beach house in California disappears, maybe whoever represents that area in 2024 will get motivated to do something in Congress. I do want to give a shout out to President Obama. This is not just a national problem, it's a global problem. But he has tried using an executive order to get polluting plants to cut down on emissions. Of course, that's being challenged. It's not enough, but it at least is a recognition that there is a problem. There is a problem. 2024, imagining 2024, I'd like to quote that sage Don Rumsfeld and say that there are a lot of unknown unknowns. I actually.
No, but he's actually. I mean, that people assume
I
that was
a
dumb.
Sage,
yeah,
Jeffrey.
yeah. You said he was a sage. Yeah, and there was no spin on that ball when you called him a sage.
So that's as much as I want to talk about Donald Rumsfeld. The rest of you. I'm trying to be funny like him, but I can't.
Yeah, no,
I
you're
can't
very
get
funny.
this. I know.
You're
So,
very funny.
the terrorism problem is obviously the urgent problem. I somehow think that by 2024 we will have figured a way out of it.
Wait, why do you think that?
Well, because I don't think, well, if we don't figure a way out of it, we'll be out of it. That's why I think. I think that is an urgent problem. And I think the way out of it is much more than tactical, which is all we seem to be doing. Who do we need to arm, and how much money and training are we going to give to this group, and how do we work within these nation states? None of that is going to be the right long-term answer. The right long-term answer is to have a strategy around this, but the strategy has to include a narrative. We have to persuade a large part of the world, and it's not just the Middle East, that we stand for something that wins the argument. And we haven't made any kind of sale, and we don't have a narrative that's compelling anymore. I somehow think we'll either be dead or we will come up with a compelling narrative. And I don't think that's an impossible thing to do. At least a part of that narrative is we listen to other people. We don't preach at them. And we together fashion a set of shared values. And those aren't hard to figure out. But I want to go to something else about 2024, because I think it's impossible to extrapolate from present problems to 10 years from now. Let me make a series of predictions about how different the world will be. One is, I predict it will be the end of the second term of Hillary Clinton. Prediction. Another is that nation states, as we know them, certainly in the Middle East, will look a heck of a lot different. It's not just the Sykes-Picot lines crumbling under our faces, but the value of nation states, other than as a reactionary force, will decrease enormously. And that is because the economy is global. Terrorism is global. The way we communicate on every level is global. And it really won't matter so much about the border between the United States and Canada. It really won't. And the value of heads of states will diminish in a globalized world. So I think the nation state will be worth a heck of a lot less than it presently is. And my final, you want me to, you going to talk to me?
No, keep going.
You going to talk to me?
I'm enjoying this so much.
Ah, you're enjoying this. All right. And third, you know, as I think about risks and what could harm us, I mean, war will be different. Robotics already are half of war. War will be fought by machines. Cybersecurity will be a huge issue. Much of the catastrophe that can befall us will be conducted through means like that, and grids and other things, if we even operate in that sort of old-fashioned way, can be threatened by cyber attacks. And finally, it just seems to me that the virtual world will almost, in many respects, this is truly chilling to me, overtake the actual world in terms of where people live, where their heads are. Aspen will still be here, don't worry, but will we all be here? So I conclude with 10 years in the cybersphere and with the current advances in technology will be a completely different world from 10 years ago.
Jane, answer this, and this is a natural place for Michael to come in. We talk about terrorists' ability. You're talking about either they're not going to be here or we're not going to be here. The only way we're not here, the only way terrorists kill large numbers of people, is if terrorist organizations manage to gain hold of non-conventional weapons. I mean, because you can only kill so many people with the usual conventional means. Barack Obama and George W. Bush share the view, I've heard both say this, that the number one national security job is to prevent the marriage of WMD and in mainly Islamist terror organizations. Do you think we're doing enough on that? And then Michael, please jump in on that and then take it wherever you want to go.
Well, remember, WMD is not just nuclear. It's also biological and chemical. And we just saw mass destruction in Syria, unfortunately, at the hands of Bashar Assad. But biological weapons can have an enormous impact, too. The trails of disease, now that people get assassinated for trying to eradicate polio in parts of the world, and we don't even vaccinate for polio anymore. I mean, you can think of horrible horribles. I think that's a Rumsfeld term, too. Oops, I wasn't going to talk about him. But the nuclear proliferations...
You secretly have warm feelings for him.
I'm speechless. But the nuclear piece is horrible. It's not just Iran-centric, it's Pakistan too. And dirty bombs can't kill as many people as big bombs can, but dirty bombs, for example, some kind of a radiological bomb going off in central Manhattan using some of these isotopes that are highly dispersible and have a half-life of 30 years can contaminate 2 square kilometers of downtown, basically incapacitate New York. So that's a dirty bomb. So yes, this is a huge problem.
Michael?
How would you like to be the last person on this panel?
Yeah. You're going to have to come up with something even worse.
Worse, I can't. On the, just a quick public service announcement. On the way out, there'll be an intern dispersing Valium pills. Yeah. So everyone should please take one and move on. Let me reframe the term 2024. Not the year 24, but the next 24 hours. What's going on in the Middle East today? And Jim talks about a possible, Gulf of Tonkin type incident in the South China Sea. Strobe was talking about climate change that might have a tipping point that will affect all of humanity. All of that is very, very possible. But what is occurring right now in the Middle East while we're sitting in the tent is sufficiently panic-inducing, where not only do you have a pressing threat against, for example, the American embassy in Baghdad. I believe it's the largest American embassy in the world. And if the folks from ISIL or ISIS get a hold of that embassy, it'll make what happened in Saigon in 1975 look like a peaceful parting. But it's not just that. It is that these forces are descending on some of the largest and most sophisticated arsenals in the world in the Arabian Gulf. And if these forces attain those arsenals, it's going to set into motion a highly combustible series of events. I'm not a representative of the State of Israel officially anymore, but I'll tell you that the Israelis will be extremely discomfited and prone to act to prevent these weapons from falling into the hands.
Are you talking about ISIL actually moving into the Gulf where there are billions and billions and billions of dollars of sophisticated American equipment and actually taking that equipment?
That's what I'm saying.
But do these groups have the ability to fly our planes, though? I mean, isn't that one of the big variables here?
They seem to have found some people who can fly helicopters.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know if the people in the Gulf have all the ability to fly the planes either. But moving toward Jordan, and at an earlier conversation we had, Jordan is Israel's security boundary from Iraq. It's not the Israeli-Jordanian border, it's the Iraqi-Jordanian border, which is Israel's security border. Israel will be very prone to act in that case as well. That sets into motion a series of combustible events. Jim mentioned the March of Folly of August 1914. My frame of reference is the March of Folly of May 1967, where several small-scale Palestinian terrorist attacks along Israel borders set into motion a concatenation of events that led to the closing of the Straits of Tiran, the exit of the expulsion of UN troops, and the Six-Day War, and we're still trying to dig ourselves out of that one. That type of rapidly unfolding, snowballing, mushrooming events could occur today within the next 24 hours. If there's a breakthrough in one of the fronts in Iraq, if Iraqi forces collapse, if the Sunnis start moving toward the Gulf area, or conversely toward Jordan, because these borders are breaking down very, very rapidly. And we talked earlier about we're literally living through history right now because for the first time in a century, the borders created by the Europeans in 1916 are being erased and no longer have the same impact they have previously. And then we go back to Jane's scenario, and that is the meetup, the encounter between WMD and radical regimes, such as the radical regime in Iran, which sets into motion another ineluctable process in which Turkey gets the bomb, Egypt gets the bomb. These same insecure regimes, unstable regimes in the Gulf get the bomb, and we won't be worrying about chemical or biological arsenals in the hands of unstable and vicious regimes. We'll be worrying about nuclear arsenals in the hands of the regimes, with non-state actors moving to achieve them. That's a pretty bleak scenario.
Jim, let's stay on Iraq now. I mean, and it's important to stay on Iraq because the history is changing rapidly. We saw 2 days ago the announcement by ISIS of the restored caliphate. And it's, on one hand, it sounds like a joke, because in order to be the restored caliphate, you've got to get the agreement of 1 billion or more Muslims. On the other hand, they are the most dynamic and fast-moving movement in the Middle East at the moment. So the phrasing sounds like a little bit of a joke, but it's not. But what's the worst that can happen?
Well, let me come at it from a slightly different angle, because I think one of the things that all of our points have in common is that, I mean, this is more than just a parlor game and trying to figure out what the worst place is. The point is to figure out what can go wrong so you can work backwards to try to prevent it from happening, right? I mean, that's
well, this is not a parlor game. You hope that this conversation is happening in the White House right now.
But the reason I say that is because the danger in the Iraq situation now is, without thinking this through, maybe not to 2024, but at least to 2015, that you'll start to do some things now that actually either make it worse or don't make it better in the long term. So the great debate now is, should the United States, the Russians have now sent planes to Iraq, shouldn't we do it too, right? And stop these horrible terrorist extremists and things. Except you have to ask the question, then what happens, right? So we get in and we side with the Maliki regime, which itself has played a major role in creating this crisis of itself. And should we now say, well, because now we have to worry about ISIS, ISIL, we now are going to have to support Maliki irrespective of what he does and whether he's created the political context. So I think, the administration has been right to say, you could intervene tactically now to try to stop these guys, but what would the longer impact in the region be? If you don't have a government in Iraq that can bring people together and reach out to the Sunnis who are siding with ISIS, in part because they felt marginalized by the Maliki government, you need a comprehensive view of the thing and then work backwards. So the worst that can happen in the short term, obviously, is there can be pressure from this on Baghdad and strengthening of some of the radical forces. But we're not going to solve that problem by leaning in and becoming part of the Shia army, where the government in Iraq is just depending entirely on its Shia population and not trying to be inclusive. So what we need to do now is to say, yes, we have some stakes in this. We are threatened. There are direct threats to the United States from extremists with al-Qaeda links coming to power. But as Jane said, we've got to think about where the longer term is and how do we position ourselves and how do we work with others who have a stake. And so we need to be clear that, yes, we might be prepared to help work against ISIS, but only in the context of a solution that would actually make things better or at least have a path going forward. So I think we do need to let the political situation color how we decide to intervene.
Do you think the White House is on top of this?
Of course. I mean, I think this is obviously a preoccupation, but I hope that the...
I don't mean on top. I don't mean are they thinking about it. I mean, do they have this in hand?
I think the issue is to articulate a broad strategy. That's what we need to hear. Maybe they have it. I don't think we've heard a broad strategy that says this is how we see the long-term solution to this problem. It involves Syria, it involves Jordan, it involves Lebanon. I mean, all of these forces that we're talking about in the region, there needs to be a sense of where would you want to get to, and what's a plausible path to get from this very ugly place we are now to a more stable, more solid place. And so some of the solutions we hear, being the air wing, doesn't seem to be the answer. Accepting the partition doesn't seem to be the answer either. What's the stable solution there? Who'll accept that? Right. So you've got to articulate the vision.
Let me do Strobe and Jane. But it's interesting because, and maybe you can answer this as well, Strobe. Yesterday, or the day before, I can't remember because I'm on Aspen time, I interviewed Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I said, sort of as a throwaway line, I said, by the way, do we have a strategy? The United States have a strategy in the greater Middle East? And he goes, no. And then we moved on to another question. Because it was pretty declarative,
Well,
answer that question and then jump on to Jim.
Yeah, I was going to suggest a kind of overarching piece of bad news that doesn't have to do with 10 years from now, but has to do with the last 6 to 12 months. And it's the following. If we were to move backwards rather than forwards, and we were having this conversation in last year's Ideas Festival, I at least would have put forward the following proposition. For the first time in human history, those of us sitting here in late June of 2013 can say that despite the fact that the centenary of World War I is coming up, we are living in a period of history where there is no real danger of major conflict between and among the great powers. Jim might have argued with me when I said that then, but he isn't going to argue with me now because that's no longer the case. Bad things have happened. I think the way Jim has characterized the great power potential for conflict in Asia is absolutely right, and it's relatively new, or at least at this level of intensity and danger. Count on me to bring Vladimir Putin into the conversation. I think what he did in a little tiny piece of Black Sea real estate was itself a tipping point, not just with regard to Russian behavior, but it played in a very dangerous way into European politics. It helped, it played into the hands of right-wing nationalists in the European elections. And I wouldn't even be surprised, Jim, I've never had a chance to ask you this, if maybe as the Chinese watched what happened in Crimea, and saw the basically tame and so far not very effective response from the West, they said, well, you know, last year we had this oil rig and we were thinking about putting it in what the Vietnamese outrageously claimed to be their waters, but we were talked out of it. We're not going to be talked out of it again. So this goes again to something Jane said earlier. Your optimism about 10 years from now is that nation states in a positive way will have receded into the background and we will make a virtue out of interdependence. I'm concerned that nation states will indeed either recede in importance or become much more nationalistic. Right. And the ability to kind of institutionalize globalization and interdependence will be going in the wrong direction, which will be bad for every topic we've brought up so far.
Jane, and then I'll...
Well, I'm not sure I said it would be a positive development, but I said that the importance of nation states is receding now, except to be pests. I mean, to impose, to try to balkanize the internet. A lot of you may not agree with me, but and do things that I think just make it harder for people to live their lives in a global economy, which was why I don't think those things will work. But I think the challenge is to find a system of governance in a world where tipping points are not just in one country, and they're not. And these territorial disputes are not in just one country. But I wanted to answer Jeffrey's question about the White House and are they thinking about 2024? My answer is no. And Congress isn't thinking about 2024 either. Both of them are thinking about November 2014, which is a few months from now, and who's going to win what elections and what mandate is who going to have to blame the other side. Let's understand our politics, unfortunately now, are a blame game. Certainly our U.S. politics. I think in many countries their politics aren't very good either. But the paradigm is to blame the other side for not solving the problem. There is no value put on solving problems because if you solve problems, the other side gets some credit. And this is a scorched earth approach. And why this matters is, let's play it out on Iraq and Iran and the rest of it. If all you're thinking about is, how do I keep my poll numbers up so I win my race, or I beat the bad guy who's the incumbent in 2014, you're going to do things that are enormously tactical and short-term, and you aren't going to think about the long-term.
Let me, I want to turn to Michael in 1 second, but let me ask this off of what you're just saying. There is this, I mean, most of us just came out from Washington, and in Washington it's fascinating and dispiriting debate. It's 80% of what we're talking about Iraq and Syria right now is, oh, it's all Obama's fault, it's all Bush's fault. Yeah. But the broader question, and I want Michael, who did represent another country,
and a nation state,
and a nation state, which is
well.
as small as a city-state,
well.
but it's still a nation state. Yeah. But there's this assumption in Washington when we have these debates that we control the weather in a way, that you know, Iraq is happening because something Obama did or something that Bush did, and you see this across whatever the discussion is about, whatever foreign problem, it's what did America do right or wrong to manipulate the situation and to either a good effect or a bad effect. And this is a very, very important question in this context. How much power does the United States have anymore to shape these conflicts and to shape these problems? Obviously on climate change, we seem somewhat impotent. And it's not clear to me that on China, we can get China to back off Japan on these questions. Michael, maybe you can start with that. Talk about, you wrote a book about the 200-year encounter between the United States and the Middle East. maybe you could talk about the level of influence and whether or not we're actually, as many people believe, receding in our importance to the world and the way it's organized.
I was going to take the conversation in a different direction. I mean, for
over
over 200 years, Americans tended to look at the Middle East as sort of a cracked mirror image of the United States. And if only we could fix the cracks, the United States would look, the Middle East would look like the United States in the Middle East. And somewhere out in the Middle East, there was a Middle Eastern George Washington who was going to unite the Middle East and lead it to democracy.
So as late as 2003, we were thinking that way.
No question about it. I mean, Thomas Jefferson invades Libya in 1801 because there's a jihadist piracy going on there. That's how they portrayed themselves as jihadists. And he had this fantasy that once he won the war against Libya in 1801, he was going to create a democracy there. So it doesn't begin with George Bush, it doesn't end with Barack Obama, it goes back to the founding fathers of this country. I think the debate now has become very polarized in this country between the sense of omnipotence and impotence. And it's either everything that we can do or everything we can't do, when in fact there's a vast area in between. And it's not endemic to America alone. Yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a major policy speech. He talked about the need basically to hunker down, to to guard our borders toward the east in view of what's happening in Iraq, to recognize an independent Kurdish nation, because that would be in Israel's interest. But it's a type of hunkering down. It's responding to a great fear within the Israeli public that we're living in the midst of turmoil, and we have to batten down the hatches. And what was missing from this speech, from my point of view, was any notion that there's an international community out there, that there may be ramifications from our inability to achieve an agreement with the Palestinians. The Palestinians may go unilaterally to the UN, may try to impose sanctions on us. And these are every bit threatening scenarios as what's transpiring perhaps in the East. They can be quite threatening to the state of Israel. So Israelis also are hunkering down, call it isolationism. And here the comparison, Jim, may not be to 1914, but to 1919. Populations like the United States who've been traumatized by long wars, Israelis who've been traumatized by 66 years of war, don't want to take risks. They want to focus inward. And I think that the choice is not between a sense of complete powerlessness or a sense of complete ability to change the world and make it look like the United States, but, for example, in Iraq, where you have the United States, I believe, has a very concrete interest in protecting its embassy, in protecting a catastrophe there, not putting another 100,000 pairs of boots on the ground, but making sure that America's vital interests are protected there. By doing that, you not only protect those interests, you also send a message. You send a message to the people in Beijing. You send a message to the people in the Kremlin that America is not powerless, that America is capable of reaching out and achieving its interests. Last point. I mean, we all lived through the events of last August with the debate over whether to send 10 Tomahawk missiles into Damascus. And it was a very pained debate here. We watched it very keenly from the Israeli side. Believe me, nobody in their wildest dreams thought that the attack of 10 Tomahawk missiles in Damascus was going to determine the outcome of the Syrian civil war. But it would have sent an ineluctable message to the world. And that would have had reverberations elsewhere in the world, whether in the South China Sea or in the Ukraine.
Very, very quickly, because we'll turn to questions, and there are probably a million of them. What are the consequences of this widespread perception? And all of us have traveled to a lot of American allies over the last year, and you hear it whether it's in Asia or Europe or the Middle East. What are the consequences of the perception that we are withdrawing, that we're not that interested in the world's problems anymore?
You know, I think they're, as Michael suggested, I mean, they're profound, because everybody has to make a whole new set of calculations about the choices they make if the United States is not in the equation. The United States. Do
you think it's true, or do you think that it's just a perception?
You know, I think there, again, an answer needs to be given. We need an articulation of strategy that says, here's what matters, here's what the stakes are. I mean, building off Michael's very good point, strategy is relating means to ends. Doesn't mean you can do everything, but it's identifying what your goals are, identifying what the resources, the tools, the incentives, the disincentives, the power tools that you have to apply against it, and then explaining what you're trying to do. And the problem in each of these cases is, I mean, the reason that Syria became so metastasized is that because it was never articulated in terms of the broader sense of when does the U.S. engage and not? When do we draw lines? When don't we draw lines? When do we honor our red lines when we draw them? This is what people want to know. They're going to build, the United States is still, I mean, we worry about where decline you just have to step back and look at the fact 50% of the world's military spending is still done by the United States. We are still overwhelmingly the biggest economic power. Yes, you can jigger up numbers to say China's got PPP and all that stuff, but it's a poor country. We are so much the dominant that all of the international community orients itself around the choices that we make. But if we create a vacuum, if we step back, they will then say, okay, now we have to live in a world. If I'm Japan, seeing a rising China, I have to make a whole different set of calculations if I don't think the United States is going to be there. Do I need nuclear weapons? Do I need to do things differently? Every country in the world begins its own inquiry around its own strategy by looking first to see how does the United States play in this situation.
Strobe, very quickly, and to sharpen this point a little bit, has the Obama administration over the last 3 years neglected to formulate a strategy and neglected to signal to the world that we're still a part of the world?
Yes. And I think it's also a matter of very justifiable, or at least arguable, decisions not to do things that has contributed to that. I am a bit mystified. Jane, you might have a perspective on this. Why a president who has shown himself to be, at least with a small g, a great communicator, hasn't used the bully pulpit. Particularly, by the way, at West Point in his most recent speech. The White House had, of course, built that up as the answer to, it was going to put an end to doubts around the world that we knew what we were doing, we had a big grand strategy, and it didn't deliver.
Jane, do you have a quick comment? Or
yeah,
we can then
I mean, I was talking about the need for a narrative. Our narrative can't be, don't do stupid stuff plus drones. That's not going to make a sale, even in this country. And there is the opportunity, and if we lose it, we lose. I mean, the world is becoming more capable, and trading markets can work around us if Congress never passes trade promotion authority and we never have fair and labor protection included trading regimes with Asia and with Europe. If we blow that, and if we keep communicating that we're pivoting away from all the hotspots in the world and that our foreign policy is shrinking, I think there are dramatically negative consequences for us.
Let's go back there.
Super interesting. Great job here in this discussion. I wanted to ask a question, because this is really interesting to the extent that you guys are largely talking about politics, right? And politics, and some of you guys have mentioned it, is to some degree getting a little, we're in a period seemingly of everyone getting a little nationalistic, right? You know, looking inward and maybe thinking about themselves as opposed to their role in the world. And contrast that to trade and commerce attempting to become more global. We're negotiating these trade agreements. You know, so I want to ask you guys and get your thoughts on, is the incentive and is the positive from the dollars and the trade and the commerce big enough to get over, you know, the politics and all the stuff that you guys are talking about now?
My answer is no. I think that, again, it's very tempting to overdo the lessons of World War I at this anniversary. But if you listen to the narrative then, there was a conviction that globalization, interdependence, all of that would make all of this impossible. And that we were it's all connected to each other, we have all too much to lose. You couldn't do dumb things like this. And yet, we saw the destruction of economic activity and wealth twice in the 20th century in just unthinkable ways. And so, yes, these are powerful forces. Yes, they knit them together. But we've seen time and time again that there are other forces that seemingly irrational, seemingly counterproductive, that can just drive it apart. And that's my great concern, is that we are too complacent in thinking that these forces that knit us together, that these disincentives to conflict will somehow carry us through in the absence of good policy to protect them.
There was a mic over here. Anybody else want to go on that?
I just wanted to say one more thing, that we can't be strong abroad if we're not strong at home. And there is a big role for a domestic agenda, and income inequality and the play out of the healthcare reform, which still needs reform, and other things require attention. So I think voters are right to say, pay attention to this. And we have war fatigue. But I think the commander-in-chief and I think members of Congress in key positions have an obligation to lead, to take political risks and explain to voters what America's role in the world is, isn't, and why it is that we have to step up to some of the hard problems.
Go ahead, sir.
You talked about how the United States could preserve hegemony with its strength, but if the United States does take a step back, what do you think a world of Russian or Chinese hegemony would look like?
That's a good question.
I can imagine, well, Jim knows China much better than I, that China might be able to create a regional hegemony. But I'll leave that to Jim. Russia, no. Putin is a stupid strategist. He doesn't know what he's doing or where it's going to lead. What he is doing is he is confirming the fears of his neighbors and his enemies, and he is making more enemies. He has made a policy to substitute for Marxism-Leninism Russian chauvinism. And that plays well with, guess who? Russians, a lot of whom are on the periphery of Russia. It doesn't help him establish anything like hegemony, and particularly not in the Asian parts of Russia, which I think, if anything, are going to be increasingly susceptible to Chinese inroads, which takes you to China.
So if you were to ask the Chinese, they would say there's nothing to fear from Chinese hegemony. Just remember at the height of the Ming Empire, when the Chinese Empire extended as far as the voyages of Zheng He to East Africa. And we were the dominant power, but we never tried to subjugate everybody. Yes, they had to come to Beijing and pay tribute, but we were a benign power, and so this will be a great world. The problem is that China's neighbors are not convinced. And when they look at China's behavior recently, they see bullying. They see a country that isn't going to be a benign hegemon that's going to produce global public goods. They see a power that's going to make everybody else subservient, that's going to insist on its way or the highway. And so I think one of the reasons we've become so concerned about China in recent years is this notion that China could rise peacefully to be a peaceful power is in doubt. And there's a huge burden, I think, on China right now to demonstrate that it can use its growing power and influence in a positive way to reassure its neighbors about how it intends to use that power. But we're not seeing a lot of that coming out of Beijing right now.
Just the last point. This conversation is about power, but it's not about ideas and values. And that's what America brings to the world. It doesn't just bring 12 battleships, 12 aircraft carriers. It brings an idea. It brings an adult supervision that neither Russia nor China can provide. And an absence of American values in the world is dangerous for humanity. And since I guess I'm the only up here speaking, it's strange to have an Israeli speaking for the international community, but any Arabs in the audience? Give me some slack on this one. We need America, and we need America's presence in the world, not just as a military power, but America's presence as an idea.
But that whole point is not just American ideas and American values. I think there are shared values across the world, many of which originated here, or at least we've been practicing for 235 years or whatever it is. But if we have a conversation with the world about this and a buy-in to a narrative that people prefer over going back to the 7th century caliphate, which I think they should prefer once they understand what the 7th century caliphate really is, I think that's when we'll start to get someplace.
Over there.
On the subject of bad news, it seems that just in the past hour, the bodies of the 3 kidnapped teenagers in the West Bank were found. And one of them is an American citizen. So if this news is true and confirmed, what kind of response?
It can't be confirmed.
Do you expect?
It's not confirmed yet. We've been watching.
So if it is, what kind of response would you expect, and what do you think would be prudent?
I can't comment because it's not confirmed. So I know that this Israeli society has been utterly seized of this issue since it occurred 2.5 weeks ago. These are 3 teenage boys who were kidnapped, and we've been hoping to find them alive and to return them to their families. This morning, as we're talking in a very theoretical way about some threats, southern Israel has been struck by rockets for the first time since 2012, fired by Hamas. Israel will respond. Again, I talked earlier about my frame of reference is the Six-Day War, not World War I, and I can see a situation where Hamas is going to fire rockets at us. We're going to be shooting back at Hamas. You do not know. It's true with any war. You know how they start. You don't know how they end. And there's going to be, if in fact there's confirmation, there's going to be tremendous domestic pressure for action, and that's going to play out on the battlefield.
I've been hesitant to bring that up because we don't have it confirmed, and there'll be plenty of time to talk about it later. But I wanted to add something to, and if you want to, I'm watching it too. If you said something that was very interesting, and it kind of brings us back to the broader stroke here. When you said you asked the Arabs in the audience to give you some slack on something, but the interesting thing about that is that the Israelis and the Arabs, meaning the Gulf Arabs, Egypt, et cetera, are almost perfectly in concert right now on a whole set of issues in terms of the destabilization of the Middle East, the threat from Shia radicalism and Sunni radicalism. And I'm curious to know, and to try to bring a bunch of this stuff together, and maybe you can talk about it, Jim, Strobe, and Jane. Do you feel that our government right now has plans in place for worst case scenarios? Let's say Jordan, for instance. Jordan as a linchpin of the Middle East. If Jordan comes under terrible pressure, do you think that we have a plan? And do you know, more to the point, what would trigger an American response? I mean, we talked about the lack of strategy. Can you give us a sense of what would trigger American responses to Chinese aggression against Japan, ISIS against Jordan, and so on? I mean, this is, I think, and I've had a number of conversations the past days here at the festival about this, and no one seems to be able to predict, because there is no strategy, no one seems to be able to predict what would prompt reactions and what kind of reactions from this administration. I don't mean to oppress you because you were in the administration.
Well, I mean, I actually will take it from a different perspective, which is, you know, I was at one point director of policy planning. And I think it's important to understand what you can and can't do with plans. The military generates millions of plans, very detailed things, because they have to worry about how do you get supplies and logistics to places and what order of battle and things you want. In political security problems, you can't overplan because you can't know the specific context. So you have to have a framework. You have to have a clear set of ideas of what matters to you and what are the tools that are available to you. You need to know your toolkit, and you need to understand what are your priorities, what matters, what's the stake, what makes a difference, and the kinds of things that will cause you to act. So you don't want people to overplan the specifics because the specifics will never happen in the way that you anticipate them. But what you want is clarity to understand what's significant. So in the East China Sea, how important to it is this? If the Chinese should decide they want to prove that Japan doesn't have administrative control of these islands, let's imagine that China decides to land a Coast Guard vessel of theirs on these islands to prove that the Japanese can't control it. We need to have thought in ahead of time, which is, will we support the Japanese, and what are the different ways in which we could do it? We don't have to figure out the specific thing we're going to do. We'll have to look at the context. You want people to look at the specifics. But that's the question, is are we thinking about where are the key interests at stake? And have we thought through the various tools that we have so that when the time comes, when Russia invades Crimea, or supports, or however you want to characterize it, you know, do we have things ready so that we're ready to respond because we've thought about the general problem?
Strobe, I mean,
just one quick point. You posed the question in a way that Jim legitimately answered it, namely, what is our plan for when the bad guys do X?
Right.
You know, that obviously has to always be part of the way we think, but it's not sufficient. We also have to have proactive action, not reactive plans. And I think there has been, for, again, reasons that we can understand in context, both geopolitical and political context, why there hasn't been enough of that, but there hasn't been enough of it.
Wait, Jane, let me just go with Strobe for one more second, if I may, because I mean, this is about being ready for the worst. We didn't seem to understand. I mean, if you asked a year ago, we had no clue that Russia was going to invade and swallow a piece of a United Nations member state. We had no idea of that. How does that, you were at high level in government, how does it happen that we're continually surprised by these bad things?
Well, that's a kind of a one-off, because I don't think Vladimir Putin had a plan to do that either. I think this was a brainstorm that occurred to him on the last days of the Sochi Olympics, when he was persuaded, literally, when he was persuaded of a big lie, to which he answered with his own big lie, and that was that this was a Western plot. That said, had we been, we and the Europeans, the EU, had we been a lot smarter in the way we managed Ukraine throughout that whole thing, we would not have, Putin would not have had the pretext or the provocation.
Well, let me say first, as a mother and a grandmother, just thinking how the parents of those 3 kids feel, it's just heartbreaking. And that goes for the mothers in Nigeria, too, whose girls haven't been found. But it is, you know, there are real feelings that people ought to have about this stuff. Strobe, I think, and many people think, that Putin did have a plan on the shelf to invade Crimea, and his insertion of covert forces as effectively as he did that could not have been a kind of last-minute make-it-up thing. That's at least based on my own experience studying how these things work. I know much less about him and Russia than you do. But I think other governments do plan, and I think that's what Jim's talking about. Maybe they plan in bad ways, but they plan. I don't think we plan enough. We have military plans, but as Mike Mullins said over and over again, I'm sure this was on your panel, Jeffrey, that the military should not be the lead policy maker in the country. It should carry out policy that is carefully made. We don't make policy carefully enough, and I'm just thinking about this Israel thing, and Israel will respond as she should, and then what will happen, and the day after, and will we be drawn into this as we are thinking about Iraq and Syria, which are not separate problems anymore. Remember, these borders are crumbling. And other places, what is our plan? How do we see this over the long term? What is our narrative? Where are our values and ideals? Not just where are our drones and our aircraft carriers.
There's a question right here. If you stand up, it would be great. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I work in Somalia on preventing extremism among youth through entrepreneurship. And through my work, I've begun to realize that some of the biggest security challenges facing the world are driven by unemployed youth in poverty who are desperate. So can you speak to a little about the link between poverty, unemployment, and inequality, and how it affects global security? I mean, you're seeing the rise of extremist groups throughout Africa who are using youth as their foot soldiers. You're seeing the rise in political unrest, which has been linked to disenfranchised youth. So if you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful question, and it's such a good question that it contains within itself its own answer, which I would put this way. We as citizens and our governments, and I mean governments plural, need to see economic development dimensions of our foreign policy as national security imperatives and international security imperatives for just the reason you say.
Can I just, I think it's important to add there because, now I'm an academic and a social scientist and all that stuff. There's absolutely no doubt that it's got to be part of the strategy. But we also got to recognize that a lot of these problems and a lot of the people who mean us harm are not poor and disfranchised youth either. And so, you've got to take, there's evil out there too. And there are things that have to be resisted. So just as we need over the long term to have a strategy to create opportunity, to give meaning to our values, to give credibility to things we do, we also have to recognize that there are other kinds of challenges out there, and we've got to be very clear-minded about them.
But they're not going to have foot soldiers.
Absolutely.
They're not going to have resonance in societies where the population as a whole feels that it's getting something out of the future and the status quo.
One quick response to that. The people who took down the Twin Towers in 2001 were not poor. Right. And we've dealt with suicide bombers in Israel who are middle class, upper class, lawyers, professionals. That doesn't mean, as Strobe says, doesn't mean they have foot soldiers usually. But the issue, again, what Jane says, it's about ideas. At the end of the day, it is a clash of narratives. I liked how you put it. And there's a very potent narrative on the other side. There's a potent narrative that says modernity is evil, that liberation of women is evil, that gay rights are evil. And this civilization, the American civilization, and again, it's not just America, it's what America represents, the idea of America, and the idea that America has seeded throughout the world. That is the idea, first of all, which Americans have to be convinced of, and they have to be willing to go out and to be able to promote and inculcate other narratives and to do battle with them, not necessarily with aircraft carriers, but with books, with lectures, with education. Entirely different battlefield.
We have to win the argument. I totally agree, and obviously some of you, with the kid in the boonies of Yemen who's deciding whether to strap on a suicide vest and end his life for this crazy belief, or to join society, presumably in Yemen, which would offer him some opportunity. We got to win that argument. We're having the same conversation in America with gang leaders in inner cities or with gang followers. And we won't win that argument just with drones and don't do stupid stuff. We'll win that argument with, values and ideals and a conversation in which views of other people are respected.
And you got to win that battle at home first, because now you're dealing with the phenomenon of jihadists who are coming from the United States, coming from Western countries, and strapping on those vests. And they're going to American schools. You have to win the battle here, too.
We have time for one last question in the back. Yes, sir.
John Debs, Palo Alto Strobe. I totally agree with you. And 2 weeks ago, Secretaries Paulson and Schultz, Mayor Bloomberg, came out with an extraordinary statement on global warming, the need for a carbon tax, hopefully a carbon tax that's revenue neutral. But I don't hear anybody taking up this very, very important issue where leaders have come out strongly for what you and I believe is the right position. How do you see this growing to where we can succeed?
And Strobe, can I just add something on top of this question, and then we'll just maybe have a quick wrap up. But you have this problem, Egypt and Egypt's population and its youth bulge, millions of educated young men without jobs, without marriage prospects then, they need jobs, they need industry. Talk about climate change as a terrible threat to humanity. You need to build businesses. You need to build factories that will employ people. How do you square these two terrible problems?
Two quick reactions, and just in telegraphic form. I think it's absolutely critical that citizens groups, civic groups, come together, faith-based groups. Anybody who can help make the case that will support politicians who want to do the right thing on climate change. We can't just leave it to the elected officials. We've got to give them an incentive and a base for doing it. As for the economics of it, Bill Nordhaus and other economists are now doing serious work that should help convince politicians who are worried about the economic downside of dealing with climate change are over-worrying that problem. They should pay much more attention both to some of the economic opportunities that are there with a green, clean economy, and also the huge economic cost if we don't address the problem.
Let me very, very quickly, Jim, if you're riding in an elevator with Barack Obama, you had 5 seconds or 10 seconds to tell him, please focus on this. What would this be?
Very simple, which is there are a lot of dangerous places out there, but it's a lot more dangerous if the United States isn't engaged and involved. You got to pick your spots, but you got to stay involved.
Strobe?
Ditto.
Jane?
Absolutely. And engage with Congress and get them on your side.
Michael?
Engage with the American people in the world. Go out and make the case. It's not just to act, but you have to lead and convince other people that you're leading in the right way.
Thank you very much for your visit. Thank you. Thank you.